So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the 1972 sci-fi horror film Horror Express, a movie that is a loose adaptation of John W. Campbell's 1938 novella, Who Goes There? A novella that's about a group of people trapped at a scientific outpost in Antarctica infested by shape-shifting monsters able to absorb and perfectly imitate any living being, including humans, which received two different film adaptations, the first in 1951 with The Thing from Another World, and again in 1982 with John Carpenter's The Thing, which stuck closely to the source material. But coming back to Horror Express, on the other hand, the reason why this movie was produced in the first place had to do with the director Eugenio Martin, if I'm pronouncing that right at all, who just got done producing Pancho Villa and still had a train set left over from that movie and decided to utilize that train set for this movie. Now, sometime after this, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the movie would get frequent airings on television, which slowly gained Horror Express a cult following among horror fans, but it was still relatively obscure by that point in time. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon a review of the movie by Brandon Tenold of Brandon's Cult Movie Reviews, where I swear the movie just kicked off and since then has become a cult classic, to a point that it even got a re-released Blu-ray by Arrow Films, which is basically the criterion for cult classics. And not only that, but it's also a movie that many fans often mistake for a Hammer horror film because it stars both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, who typically play in a lot of Hammer horror movies, even though Horror Express is in actuality a Spanish-British co-production. But going back to the Brandon Tenold review of Horror Express, I've been meaning to check this movie out because of that review. Sure, it took me almost 10 years to get around to watching it, but better late than never, which begs the question, is the Horror Express a bona fide cult classic? As for the plot of the movie, an English anthropologist has discovered a frozen monster in the frozen wastelands, which he believes to be the missing link. He brings the creature back to Europe aboard a trans-Siberian express, but during the trip the monster thaws out and starts butchering the passengers one by one. As the anthropologist, along with several other passengers, unite to stop the creature, they quickly discover that the monster isn't what it appears to be. Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, actually, before I go any further, something you should know about me in relation to Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, because I am fully aware that these two actors have played in a lot of Hammer horror movies, and here's the thing, I have never seen a single Hammer horror movie, because those type of movies were either A, not my cup of tea, or B, if I wanted to watch them, I don't exactly know where to start in regards to the watching order of it. And why I bring this up, from my understanding, you have Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, who play in a lot of these Hammer horror movies, usually playing diametrically opposing roles, with Christopher Lee playing a character like Count Dracula, whereas Peter Cushing usually plays Van Helsing or some other hero. Now, fast forward to this movie, here's a situation in which both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are playing the heroes, and not only that, but apparently outside of the movie, no matter if it's this or the Hammer films, apparently Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing were really good friends, so they already have a good chemistry with each other that does shine through their performances in this movie. And not only that, but I think this is the only time Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing play characters that are both on the same side. So I could imagine that if you're a fan of the Hammer horror movies, this must have been a treat to see in this movie. But overall, I do think that both the combination of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing's chemistry with each other is a highlight of the movie as far as their acting is concerned. And as far as the other actors are concerned, I think everyone gives the right performance for the characters they are given. Although if I had to talk about one actor in particular, that being Telly Savalas, I'll talk more about him in a few minutes, but when he does show up in a movie, he is very entertaining. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the humor, because for a movie that's predominantly horror, there are splashes of humor sprinkled throughout the movie, some intentional, some unintentional, but as far as the bits of humor that are intentionally meant to be funny, most of the jokes did land for me, and they don't overshadow any part of the movie. It's not like some of the more recent Marvel movies where they tell a joke and they really linger on this joke for several minutes. No, this movie just tells a joke, it's done the moment it started, and moves on to the next bit. And not only that, but there were some lines of dialogue that I did find to be very hilarious, with my favorite being, "Monster? We're a British, you know." Another aspect of the movie I liked is that despite this movie being what some would call a leftover movie in that sense where it's quite literally using props and costumes from a previous production and being reused for this production, the movie does make good use of said reused assets, such as the costumes and the train itself. Because for a good majority of the movie, it's set on this train. And there is this sort of subgenre of horror movies where I would like to call the one location horror, where it's quite literally a horror movie in which a character or characters get stranded or stuck in one location and you never leave said location. And while this movie definitely is set in one location, that predominantly being the train itself, at least the movie makes good usage of the train, because it's not like you have all of the characters staying in one passenger car. You have the characters quite literally interacting with different parts of the train, from certain passenger cars to the dining area, the luggage compartment, and so on and so forth. So at least you do have a nice variety of locations set on the train itself. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the atmosphere, at least during the portions that take place on the train itself. Because if I had to describe the atmosphere, it's very unsettling, which makes a lot of sense given that you have the main cast of characters getting very paranoid about who or what is killing off the passengers. For a point of comparison, the atmosphere of this movie is very similar to the paranoid atmosphere you feel in John Carpenter's The Thing, which makes me wonder whether or not John Carpenter was aware of this movie and took some influence from it when applying the atmosphere to his movie. Whatever the case may be, this movie has some really good atmosphere to support the paranoia that occurs within the movie. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the unpredictability of the plot itself, because on top of this movie being a one-location horror survival, it's also part genre shift movie. And what I mean by that is, you have a movie such as Rodan, From Dusk Till Dawn, to even Barbarian, where it starts out as one type of movie, but as it progresses, it turns into something else. The Horror Express is no exception. And before I go any further, I'm going to spoil some plot details about the movie itself. Because for the first third, The Horror Express plays out like a killer caveman movie for a bit. And there's a moment where one of the main characters kills the caveman. Now, if this was any other horror movie, that would be the end, but no, that's just the end of Act 1. Because what ends up happening next is that the person who ends up killing the caveman actually gets possessed by the caveman's soul, because in reality, what's actually killing all the passengers is actually some alien entity that happened to possess a caveman first, and then transferred its consciousness into a human. And this is where it becomes this sort of paranoia thriller for a bit, and then by the time you get to the ending, it turns into a zombie movie. And when I say all those details, on pen and paper, it sounds as if this movie could not function. But when put together with the right amount of ingredients, it works better than expected. Because if there is one plot thread that keeps all of these elements wrapped together, is the fact that it's set on a train, which is what really helps all of these plot beats work together as well as they do. And as far as the alien itself is concerned, I really like its motivation in terms of why it does what it does. Because on the one hand, yes, it is indeed killing passengers, but it's merely done so either out of survival, or it's gathering the intellect of said individual to use to its advantage. Because the main goal of the alien entity in this movie is to, quite literally, gather the knowledge to build a rocket so it can leave Earth and go home, giving the alien entity a very understandable motivation. Now, aspects of the movie I have mixed feelings about revolve around the character of the Cossack captain Kazan, who is played by Telly Savalas, if I pronounce the name right at all. And my biggest problems with the character come down to one or two things. The first problem being screen time, because I don't think Captain Kazan has that much screen time, because if I had to make an estimate, I think he has about maybe less than 10 minutes of screen time in the entire movie. And keep in mind, this is a 90-minute feature, which I find to be kind of weird, given that when I at least look up the production to this movie, it seemed like he was a major reason why the movie was made in the first place, given that this movie, as I mentioned at the beginning of this review, is essentially like a leftover movie where the filmmakers wanted to reuse certain props, costumes, and actors from some previous project. And one of the big turning points was Telly Savalas. And keep in mind, sometimes when you look up the billing to this movie, he's sometimes third bill, right behind Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, yet he doesn't really have that much screen time, so I felt that was a little bit of a letdown in some ways. And then second problem I have with the character is, why is he on board the train? Because he doesn't show up until literally an hour into the movie, and when he does, he hops aboard the train that all of our characters happen to be on, and I really didn't understand why he and his men boarded the train in the first place. Maybe they gave the reason and it just flew right past me, but I wish they established his reasoning a little better. Now, despite all that, I wish there was more of him, because I do think the character of Captain Kazan is super entertaining. And as I mentioned earlier, this character has what feels like 10 minutes, but you could tell the actor of Telly Savalas was having so much fun with the character. He's just chewing scenery left and right in the scenes he appears in, which not only make him entertaining, but also seeing him interacting with both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing is also hilarious. I mean, there's quite literally a point in time where Christopher Lee's character is talking to him and insulting him, and you have Captain Kazan having his back towards him, and he grabs literally the fist of one of his goons and straight up uses his goon's fist to punch Christopher Lee's character in the balls, which is both hilarious but also really epic at the same time. So it's just a case that I wanted to see more of his character throughout the movie. And not only that, but after watching this movie, I feel a little more inspired to check out more films with Telly Savalas to see if he has that charisma in some of his other movies. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the ending itself, because on pen and paper, it's a crazy idea for a climax, because what happens is it turns out the monster has the ability to resurrect its victims, basically becoming zombies. So on pen and paper, the movie concludes by becoming a zombie flick on a train. So conceptually, the stakes are raised in that sense, but the execution felt so anticlimactic, because just as the movie even introduced this idea, the climax ends, and we see the characters are just taking a moment to just ponder their journey on this train, surviving this whole ordeal. And then a few moments later, the movie just ends. And it's just one of those cases where I sat there going, really? You introduced this really cool idea, but they didn't do anything with it. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, the first 20 minutes are a little rough, because the pacing is a little slow going at first. And although it does improve after the 20-minute mark, the first 20 minutes are a little slow-paced. Another problem, and its biggest gripe, is the editing is all over the place. Because you might have a character doing one thing, but then it might cut to someone else, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. It just randomly cuts to different scenes, but there's no flow to it. For example, within the first 20 minutes before everyone gets on the train, we see someone trying to break into the crate that contains this frozen monster, which is revealed not to be completely frozen. And a few moments later, this individual dies. Now, we then cut to Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing's characters talking to an employee at the train station trying to get tickets for Christopher Lee's character. And eventually police show up asking Christopher Lee about his cargo. And the scene plays out with them conversing, but then randomly it just hard cuts to this bird-eye view of people surrounding the crime scene, with police trying to keep bystanders back away from the dead body, while we slowly pan towards this Russian monk who's praying to God. And then suddenly he introduces himself to Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing's character like he had already been pre-established. And it just makes no sense, because before that point, we never saw this character before, but then suddenly we're just introduced to him mid-praying, and then suddenly introducing himself to Christopher Lee's character like he'd been there the entire time. And to me, it just felt as if there was a couple scenes missing in between because they don't really do a good job of establishing certain characters or plot lines for the remainder of the movie. But again, like I said, once you get around the 20-minute mark where the creature breaks out and goes on a killing spree, then that's when the movie, in regards to its pacing and editing, improves. Another problem that I have with the movie is one of missed opportunities. Because as I established earlier with this review, there is a certain unpredictability to the narrative itself in terms of how it flows, revolve around the creature itself. And to continue off that, it's established that the creature, when it kills somebody through a very particular method, it absorbs their knowledge, gaining all their memories. It uses those memories to its advantage. So before the creature properly breaks out of the crate it's in, we get introduced to this baggage man who is heard humming a particular tune to several of the main characters of the movie. Now, you fast forward to the point where the creature breaks out of its crate and manages to kill the baggage man. It too does the exact same thing, and as it's traversing the train, it starts singing that tune. Now sure, there are a few passengers who do hear it going, that sounds very delightful. And it's only for this one scene. The why I bring this up, there are points in time where I feel like we should have heard the creature sing that tune a little more to establish tension among the main characters, because there is a point where the main cast, including the policeman, find the corpse of the baggage man. So there should have been a point sometime later in the movie where either the police or Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing's character hear that tune and they get concerned because, again, they realize that the baggage man is dead, and that just tells them, oh, the creature is nearby, kind of thing. That's just an example, but I feel like there should have been more of that kind of repetition throughout the movie. Another problem I have with the movie is how the movie doesn't really do a good job of taking advantage of certain information. And what I mean by this, Christopher Lee's character is established to be very intellectually smart. And there are points in time where he just happens to be at a particular point on the train and he sees everything that plays out before the murders begin. But later in the movie, he's talking to this one character who happens to be talking to someone else. And they're like, oh yeah, no, I totally saw so-and-so place these items in the safe. That really should have raised Christopher Lee's, the suspicions of Harold Saxon or Christopher Lee's character, because he was clearly there, and he knows that that particular character wasn't there at that time. So he really should have looked at him and going, how do you know this? And then have him talking to the remaining cast of characters that he trusts, establishing that I think this guy was behind it because of reasons X, Y, and Z. But no, he just keeps this information to himself and never tells anyone about it. Now sure, because of the movie's sense of paranoia, because of the way it's structured, and it's probably one of those things where he's just trying to be very cautious, but I feel like this is one of those characters that should have known better and at least informed a few people about what this particular individual said at this point. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around a particular death scene, because there's a point in time where we have a character who's now under the influence of the monster, and we see him enter this room with two people, one sleeping, one not sleeping, and he decides to kill the person who's awake. And as he's killing this person, the other passenger who's sleeping does not wake up at all during this whole incursion, which really impressed me because I sat there wondering, how in the hell could someone sleep through someone getting murdered in the same exact room? I mean, the only logical explanation is that she's one hell of a heavy sleeper, which I guess I can relate to in that sense because I myself have slept through both a fire alarm and an earthquake, so I guess I can't give this one character too much flack. But still, I think if this was any other movie, you probably would have had that character wake up at the wrong time, witness the entire murder, and then get killed themselves. But as it is, her sleeping during the murder is actually kind of a significant plot point for the remainder of the movie. Another problem I have with the movie is the introduction of a spy. And honestly, I don't even understand why she was even in the movie. I felt like she didn't really contribute much to the movie other than being a victim to the monster itself. Not only that, but I feel that the scenes revolving around her, you could have removed altogether, and I don't think the movie would have been affected at all, save for maybe one plot convenience that easily could have been written a little differently. I mean, sure, you could make the argument that this would have opened up a plot hole within this one safe being stolen, but I feel like you could have rewritten that so that you could have had a scene similar to something like the scene from John Carpenter's remake of The Thing, where all the characters gather to look at the blood samples only to open up the safe and see that the blood's been tampered with, leading to a bunch of the characters' paranoia ever growing amongst themselves. And not only that, but when they do introduce this spy, for some reason I kept thinking she was the Countess. Not sure why, but I did. Because, again, like I stated earlier, there are points in time where the movie's editing doesn't really do a good job of establishing characters, so I think this was a case of me thinking this was the Countess because they don't really introduce this character up front. She just kind of shows up in the movie like the priest. And speaking of which, my final problem with the movie is the priest himself. Because for the first 2/3 of the movie, Prajadov is a priest and he's very much a man of God, believing that the specimen Harold Saxon brought onto the train is Satan itself. But then later in the movie, when he does confront someone who happens to be possessed by the monster, his entire character takes a 180 and becomes a devil worshiper, pleading that, "I will serve you, Satan." And this comes straight out of nowhere because there's no hint that he was slowly being corrupted by the monster's influence. No, he just out of nowhere goes from being a man of God to becoming a devil worshiper. So for my final verdict of Horror Express, I'll say this much. After watching the movie, I now understand why this movie is slowly becoming a cult classic. For starters, the entire plot is really original and unpredictable in the same way that Barbarian is original and unpredictable. You also have Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, who have really good chemistry with each other. And although Terry Savalas doesn't really have much screen time in this movie, when he does show up, it's very entertaining. And the movie actually has a good balance of atmospheric horror, along with some bits of humor. Although, that all said, I do think the first 20 minutes are a little rough to get through, and there are certain characters that I wondered why were they even in the movie in the first place if they didn't really contribute anything, or wondered why one character was written one way but then suddenly turned into a bad guy at the last minute is a little confusing. Overall, Horror Express is a pretty good movie that's worth watching as long as you know what you're getting yourself into. And before I give my final rating, what did everybody else have to say about Horror Express? So it looks like the movie got generally favorable reception, and so for my final rating of Horror Express, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So, what is your favorite genre shift movie? And see you later.